The room didn't erupt when it happened. It tightened, like the air itself had been grabbed by the throat because this was Villa Capri, Frank Sinatra's sanctuary, his back table kingdom, where power sat with a napkin on its lap and a glass of whiskey within reach, and everyone in the room knew the rules even if they'd never spoken them out loud. You didn't cross Frank, you didn't contradict Frank, and you definitely didn't embarrass Frank in public. The Rat Pack was there that night, relaxed, laughing, fresh off Vegas, the kings of Hollywood pretending for a few hours that they were just friends sharing dinner, until a nervous young waiter placed a plate down in front of Sinatra, and everything changed with the simple press of a knife into meat that was a shade too pink. Frank's mood turned instantly, his voice slicing sharper than the steak ever could, his words landing on that kid like blows, the kind of humiliation that makes your stomach drop because you know it's undeserved, but you also know no one will stop it. No one ever did. People looked away because that's what survival looked like in Sinatra's orbit. Then Dean Martin did the unthinkable. No raised voice, no performance, no anger, just calm authority cutting through the tension as he told Frank to let it go. And when Frank bristled, Dean didn't retreat, didn't soften, didn't laugh it off. He called it what it was: bullying. In a room where careers ended with phone calls, Dean told the most feared man in Hollywood to shut up and eat his steak. Time stalled. Forks froze midair. Everyone waited for the explosion that never came. Instead, Frank looked at Dean, really looked and smiled. Not because he'd won, but because he'd been checked by the only man in his life who could do it without fear. That moment wasn't about a steak or a waiter or even a temper. It was about respect. Dean didn't need Frank's power, and Frank knew it. And that truth gave Dean a strength no intimidation could touch. The kid walked away with his dignity intact, the room exhaled, and a legend was born. Not of dominance, but of character. Years later, people would still talk about that night. Not because Frank lost control, but because Dean Martin proved that real class isn't staying quiet when someone is cruel. And real friendship isn't agreement, it's honesty. In an industry built on fear and flattery, one man chose decency over silence, and the most powerful man in the room listened. And what makes that night echo through Hollywood history isn't just that Dean Martin spoke up, it's what happened afterward. The subtle shift no one could quite explain, but everyone felt, because Frank Sinatra never forgot it, and neither did anyone who witnessed it. From that night on, there was an unspoken understanding that Dean occupied a different space in Frank's world, a space no amount of fame, fear, or loyalty test could manufacture. Frank still had his temper, still exploded, still ruled rooms by sheer force of will. But when Dean was present, there was a line Frank was less willing to cross. Not because he was afraid, but because he respected the one man who loved him enough to risk everything to tell him the truth. That kind of loyalty couldn't be bought or bullied into existence, and Frank, for all his flaws, recognized authenticity when it stared him down. Sammy Davis Jr. would later admit that watching Dean that night rewired his understanding of power because Sammy knew that talent, fame, and even Frank's protection couldn't give him the freedom Dean had. Dean's power came from independence, from not needing approval, from being whole on his own. That was why Frank listened. Not because Dean was louder, but because Dean was unmovable. And that lesson followed everyone who heard the story, especially those who worked around powerful people their entire lives. The waiter, Michael Romano, carried it with him forever, not as a tale of humiliation, but as proof that dignity can survive even the harshest rooms when one person decides cruelty isn't acceptable. Years later, when Michael told the story, his voice still shook. Not from fear, but from gratitude, because Dean Martin didn't have to do what he did, and that's exactly why it mattered. He didn't gain anything from it. He risked everything. And that's what separated him from the countless yes men who orbited Sinatra, laughing too loudly, agreeing too quickly, disappearing quietly when Frank turned on them. Dean stayed because he was never pretending, Their friendship endured storms, arguments, long silences, but it lasted because it was honest. And honesty, especially in Hollywood, is rarer than talent. Frank once said privately that the people he trusted most were the ones who told him when he was wrong, and there was only one name he ever said without hesitation: Dean. Not the smooth crooner, not the charming drunk, not the easygoing joker the public thought they knew, but a man with a steel spine hidden behind a relaxed smile. That night at Villa Capri stripped away the myth and revealed the truth. Dean Martin wasn't fearless, he simply valued decency more than comfort. And Frank Sinatra, the most intimidating man in show business, valued that decency more than his own ego. That's why he smiled. That's why he ate the steak. And that's why the story survived long after both men were gone. Because beneath the glamour, beneath the legends, beneath the Rat Pack mythology, it revealed something timeless. Real strength isn't about how many people fear you. It's about who is brave enough to stop you when you're wrong. And real friendship isn't built on loyalty tests or shared power, but on the rare courage to say enough. What happened after that night didn't make headlines, wasn't printed in gossip columns, and never became a publicity story, but it traveled the only way truths travel in Hollywood. Quietly, through whispers, through staff kitchens, through dressing rooms, through people who understood what they had just witnessed, because power had blinked first. In the days that followed, Villa Capri staff noticed something subtle but unmistakable. Frank was different there. Still demanding, still particular, still Frank Sinatra, but the edge had dulled just enough to matter. Not because he was afraid of consequences, but because he had been reminded of something rare. That unchecked power without conscience turns into something ugly, and Dean Martin had held up that mirror without flinching. The Rat Pack never spoke about it openly, but the dynamic shifted. Sammy watched Dean differently after that night, with awe and relief mixed together, because he understood something deeply personal had just been demonstrated. That respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from knowing someone can walk away and chooses not to. Dean didn't lord the moment over Frank, didn't joke about it later, didn't use it as leverage, because that wasn't who he was. He treated Frank the same the next day, the next week, the next year, which is precisely why the moment mattered. Frank, for all his bluster and rage, was a man who valued loyalty above everything, and loyalty to him wasn't silence, it was honesty. The others around him protected his ego. Dean protected his integrity. That distinction stayed with Frank for the rest of his life. Years later, people would notice that when Dean was in the room, Frank's temper had a ceiling. He still exploded, still cursed, still intimidated, but never passed the line Dean had drawn that night with nothing more than a calm voice and an unblinking stare. The waiter, Michael, carried that moment like a talisman for the rest of his life. Not because a celebrity defended him, but because someone with nothing to gain chose decency anyway. And that lesson followed him into every restaurant, every staff member he trained, every moment he had power over someone else. Dean Martin never framed himself as a hero, but heroes rarely do. He understood something fundamental about strength that most powerful men never learn. Authority means nothing if it isn't restrained by humanity. Frank Sinatra was feared because he could destroy people. Dean Martin was respected because he wouldn't let that destruction go unchecked. And that is why, when history looks back at the Rat Pack, after that night, something subtle shifted. Not in public, not in headlines, but in the private gravity between the two men, because Frank Sinatra never forgot who had the courage to stop him when no one else would. And Dean never let that moment turn into leverage or legend. They went back to joking, drinking, performing, pretending nothing had happened. But beneath it all, there was a new understanding, an unspoken contract that said truth mattered more than ego. Frank still had his temper, still exploded, still terrified rooms, but there were moments when he'd catch himself, glance at Dean and pull back just enough, and that mattered. The waiter went on with his life, unaware that his worst night had become someone else's best example of decency, and Dean never told the story himself because he didn't see it as heroism, just obligation. To Dean, power meant responsibility, not permission, and friendship meant telling the truth, even when it cost you comfort. Years later, when the Rat Pack faded and the lights dimmed, that moment endured because it revealed something Hollywood rarely shows. That real strength isn't dominance, it's restraint. And real loyalty isn't silence, it's courage. The stories that endure aren't just about swagger or talent or excess, but about moments like this when the coolest man in the room proved that courage doesn't shout, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't perform. It simply speaks when silence would be easier, and in doing so, reminds everyone watching what real class actually looks like.